This recording is part two of chapter one from the 10th edition. So this is where I left off in part one. So some defining features of special education, again, it's not a place, right? It is services and individually planned instruction, specialized instruction, adaptations, intensive targeted instruction, goal-directed instruction based on individual goals, research-based teaching methods, and instruction adjusted on the basis of student performance. Nowhere on this slide or in the textbook does it say special education is a place. Let's put the child in special education. That's not what it is. Okay, so hopefully I'm hammering that through. So, students with learning and behavior problems, most of them spend much of their time in the gen ed classroom with support services, maybe reading or math specialists or teaching assistants, something like that. Some of them, there might be some paraprofessionals, formerly called kind of classroom assistants, with direction from classroom teacher. These paraprofessionals might provide one-on-one instruction, behavioral support, social skill development, motivation, stuff like that. And there is what's called the continuum of services provided by IDEA, which I'm going to show you in just a second. Placement is in the least restrictive environment, whatever is the most appropriate for that student. Okay, just kind of some statistics, very old statistics. Yes, I understand that. So most students with disabilities were in typical schools, 75% in gen ed classrooms for 40% or more of each day. And honestly, those numbers have probably gone up since then. Students who are gifted or at risk are also most often in gen ed settings. So going back to IDEA, individualized education programs, IEPs, we'll talk about that. Least restrictive environment, that's what I'm getting up to. Due process safeguards, and don't worry about that parent experiences activity. My bad, people, my bad. And then response to intervention, okay, and which we will talk about that as well. So where should students with disabilities be educated? Oh my goodness gracious. Where should students with disabilities, how about we throw in a B? So placement is determined through the IEP process and is determined on a case-by-case basis. So what is the least restrictive for one student might not be the least restrictive for another student. Yes, we want students included as much as possible with their non-disabled peers, but again, it might not be appropriate for a particular student. So we need to think about that. What is the least restrictive for that student, or the LRE, okay? So here's the continuum of placements. Instruction gen ed classes, right, with special education supports and or services, not a place. Special classes, which are kind of self-contained, some of those self-contained classes in schools. Special schools, which are pretty segregated, and then home instruction and instruction in hospitals and institutions. So this is up here, this is considered the least restrictive, and these two, they're kind of interchangeable, but one has to be last. Those two are the most restrictive. And if you have the textbook, take a few minutes and look through the textbook. There are some really good videos in here. This is a 10th edition. I think this is a little kid named Tyler. He's a fourth grader with learning disabilities. So if you have time, or if you have the e-text, watch this video. I don't have any assignments for him or anything, but you can watch it and just think, if do you feel the supports and services that were put in place for him were successful? And if so, how was this demonstrated? He's really cute, so if you have the time, I would just recommend watching him for a few minutes. All right, so back to the PowerPoint. I just wanted to show you that. And, there are some other videos throughout as well that you may or may not want to watch. Okay, so that's a continuum of placements. Special ed kind of, in the past, there was a self-contained classroom. Students with disabilities, again, would go to a place, right? They would go to special ed. And so there was little interaction with non-disabled peers. Today, fewer students are educated in this type of classroom, and really some districts and some schools are really trying to do away with self-contained classrooms. So then it became the resource room model. This is actually I taught self-contained and resource. I taught both. So this is where students go to the resource room for only part of the day, specialized instruction. Now I think it's called resource room. It's called academic support classroom. It's called, there are a number of different terms. Mostly they're receiving their education or instruction in the gen ed classroom, and then they might get pulled out though for some, maybe they have an IEP with math goals. So they might come out of the gen ed classroom and go into the resource room just to work on math, and then they would go back to gen ed. But again, now, a lot of places are really looking for inclusive ed programs, right? So resource programs got, started being criticized. Of course, which everything's criticized. We all know how education goes. So then since about the, 1980s, 1990s, there's been a call for the dismantling of pullout programs. So, in special ed, there's kind of a pendulum as well. So, kind of what happens, one decade, then it falls out of favor, then it goes back, so we all know things go back and forth. More recently, again, the terms inclusion and responsible inclusion have been used. So some advantages of inclusion, provides all students opportunities for social interaction, not just students with disabilities interacting with students with gen ed, but the other way around. So everyone can see, hey, well, these kids, they're just like me overall. It provides students ease in accessing the general education curriculum, typically with supports, right, or with services. We typically see academic improvement and, again, positive outcomes for students with and without disabilities. Some disadvantages are that the gen ed teachers may not have been involved sufficiently and may not support inclusion, especially, and I hate to say this, but especially some teachers who have been teaching for 30, 40 years. That's not how it was done when they first started, which I totally understand. And so some of them, are still like, nope, I can't have any students with disabilities in my classroom. They might not have the skills, right, to either collaborate with other teachers or to work with those students. So, that's something we're continually trying to improve. Full inclusion of students, may take into gen ed classrooms may take away from students without disabilities. I've heard that complaint many, many times, which is true. Current funding, teacher training, all of these things, teacher certification. In some states, there's a special, some states, there's a special ed kind of teacher training track and a gen ed teacher training track. And really, they should be more similar because the same thing, some of the same strategies are going to work for all of those students. And again, for some students with disabilities, they do better when served in special ed classes by special ed teachers. That goes back to that least restrictive environment. And what's the most appropriate for one student is not necessarily the most appropriate for the next student. So facilitating instruction inclusion, we want to think about effective cooperative and collaborative methods. We'll talk about that in one of our chapters. Facilitate the acceptance of students with disabilities, and that's where you're going to come in. Even if you're a gen ed teacher, you're going to need to facilitate the acceptance of students with disabilities, and especially anyone in early childhood. The earlier we can start, including these students with disabilities, and letting the rest of the class see, hey, they're a part of our class too. Then by the time they get to 9th, 10th grade, those little friends who were friends from when they were 4 or 5 years old, they're going to support and they're going to include and they're going to accept those students with disabilities. So some of this really starts from you promoting acceptance and implement instructional strategies that support inclusion. And that's where hopefully this textbook will come in. Perceptions of inclusion, generally a positive attitude. Admin tends to support it. And educators see that inclusion has a positive impact on other students for the most part, right? So again, inclusion decisions are made by the IEP team, okay, which is composed of the child's guardians, special ed teacher, gen ed teacher, admin, other professionals. We'll talk all about that. And the basis for decisions about inclusion, again, not just one size fits all. We have to look at what fits each student. Classroom observations, progress monitoring, how are they doing? Let's look at some of their assessment data. Students' response to interventions. We'll talk about response to intervention. I'm sure you've heard about it before, but we will talk more about it this semester as well. Parents' insights about students' performance and previous teachers' views about students' performance. So we want to take all of those factors into account when we're thinking about where is the best placement for each individual student. So how do we identify students with learning disabilities? Well, typically what was used was the IQ achievement discrepancy method, where we have the difference between the child's IQ score and their achievement scores, right? So we're kind of, they have an average IQ, but they are performing below average in one or more academic areas. That's what that difference between the IQ score and achievement score it means. This is really, this is what was used again back in the day, but it's really kind of questionable, and I like that word, because typically what happens is they wait for the student to fail. They wait until 3rd or 4th or 5th grade, and then people are like, oh yeah, I guess they're not really where they're supposed to be, So that's all those years, basically kindergarten through fifth grade that were essentially wasted without providing them with special education services. It's also very expensive. The tests usually have to be administered by a school psychologist. Not every school has a school psychologist. And it's not really helpful, giving a standardized test, an IQ test, not really helpful to teachers in improving and modifying the day-to-day instruction. So now what's more prevalent is response to intervention or multi-tiered system. You may have heard this MTSS or RTI. This is a preferred approach recommended by IDEA. And so we're going to identify identification is partially based on low response to intervention. We provide them all this intervention, all this intervention, all this intervention, and the student does not respond. That may indicate that they have a learning disability. And we can start this process earlier. There's early intervention or early identification and early intervention. And we will, of course, talk more about RTI as we go along as well. Developing an IEP, individualized education program. So every student with a disability who qualifies for special ed services must have an IEP that is reviewed, designed, developed, implemented annually. The team will consist of the administrator, parents or guardians. I know I kind of said that weird. I had a weird inflection. Special ed teacher, gen ed teachers, especially, high school, you're going to want all the gen ed teachers involved. Evaluator and other professionals as appropriate, and the student when appropriate. And we'll talk about transition for students. So 9 elements of the IEP. I'm going to let you all read this, and of course it also is in your textbook. And you want to think about SMART goals: specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, time limited. And we will talk more about this. Remember, this is just chapter 1. We also want to think about how we're going to involve the parent or the family, the guardian, whoever is responsible for that student. They need to be involved in the IEP process. So we want to try to schedule when the family can attend the meetings. If they can't take time off from work, well, especially now, virtual, Zoom, those are all the rage, right? Phone calls, whatever. I had a student once, the mom could not get out of work, so myself and the social worker went, and she said that was fine. We went to her workplace and we sat outside on at a picnic table, and we conducted our IEP meeting there after sending home. I'd already sent her everything. We had talked over the phone, and we were able to meet, face to face with her on something that worked for her schedule. So you want to involve family, home visits, calls, emails, whatever, sending stuff home in the student's backpack, whatever. If the family needs a translator, we need to make sure to provide that. Providing copies of meeting documentation, both before and after the meeting. So student involvement, and over here it says age 16. Some schools start even at age 14. So you want to get the student involved, though. You want to get them involved in transition. Sorry, I skipped ahead. Because then they're going to have more buy-in. They're going to have more ownership of what you're saying, especially if you end up working in high school, and you may or may not, but those students need to be involved in what we're planning for them after high school. So some key elements of the transition planning process, looking at the students' transition needs. What do they need? And then what education and planning can we provide before or as they are transitioning from high school to post-secondary? Okay, and feedback about performance and guidance, instructional goals, linkage goals, how to access needed services, support, community services and community supports, and documentation of students' academic achievement, functional performance, recommendations on assistance for individual needs, stuff like that. Again, many of you may not be involved in when students are transitioning from high school to post-secondary life, but some of you might be. Who knows where you're going to end up. Okay, and then a few more things: teaching students with learning behavior problems. We want to build on the students' knowledge and skills and strategies. It's all different. They're all different, right? As is your teacher knowledge, skills, beliefs, and attitudes. So really learn how to use the two of them together, right? Instructional cycle shapes teaching and learning process. You want to assess the progress, then you design your instruction, then you're going to deliver your instruction, then you're going to differentiate. And there's a nice visual in the textbook that we'll get to as we go along. Okay, assessing progress. I only have a few more seconds. So you want to use pre-assessment. You want to monitor their progress. You want to select tools for progress monitoring. We'll talk a lot more about all of this, again, as the chapters go along. And you want to make records of what procedures, effectiveness, all of these kind of things. We'll talk a lot about progress graphs and charts, curriculum-based measurement. You might be familiar with some of these terms, which is great. Okay, and then one last thing, designing differentiated instruction. That's where this textbook gets into the textbook gets into some really specific, those instructional activities, right? And some strategies. That's why I continue to use this textbook. Okay, so we want to think about, providing opportunities for student practice, individualized feedback, group students with similar needs, flexible grouping, adapt, use explicit instruction, small segments, and all of these other ways to design differentiated instruction. Okay, there's a copyright. All right, so that's the end of chapter 1.